Good morning, remains with black-sounding names such as Lakeisha and Jamal. But here's the catch, the qualifications were the same. It shows that pre-installed views of the black people being inferior and used as tools in the process of enslavement is still being shown today through racism and much more. Now, finally, let's focus on the emotional effects. Philosopher Frantz Fanon describes how racial domination produces internalized inferiority and fractured identity. These wounds act as self-perception and collective worth. I said the point of information. Your mic is muted. Sorry.
The point of information about the point you made about racism, which is still a major issue. We recognize that. But we believe that economic reparations would help with this, as they would provide increased education and social integration. For example, at the moment, education in the Caribbean faces major issues, and only 4.5% passed their secondary education. And we believe that
yes.
You can go ahead. Presentation.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Again, and as I stated before, economic benefits, economic education only targets our material well-being. It can only boost our material well-being. What we are seeking to, when we say we are seeking to restore our social dignity and self-worth, we are seeking to target the inner self, restore the wounds and heal the wounds that they would have been inflicted in the past. Now, allow me to move on to my second point, stating that reparations are not reparations without repair. It is not reparations without the restoration of social dignity and self-worth. And that blatantly shifts the entire meaning of reparations to other transactions such as developmental aid, grants, and financial assistance. If we don't consider that social and moral aspect, it will become these things. The CARICOM 10-point plan agrees with our side of the motion, as apology is the first and foremost, the primary step in their plan. And while we are saying, I decline the point of information, while we are saying we need the money for the 4 other steps in 10-point plan, the end goal of those plans are not economic benefit, but actually to recognize and acknowledge that enslaved people were wrong for allowing the descendants to feel heard. A study when Japan created the Asian Women's Fund in the 1990s to compensate former comfort women, many survivors rejected the payments because they felt the Japanese state had not issued a full and unequivocal apology. They failed to acknowledge the pain and suffering comfort women would have had to endure for years, and furthermore, not repairing sense of self, not repairing that dignity, and not repairing that self-worth. The dissatisfaction was not about the economic benefits. It was about the absence of recognition and responsibility. And ladies and gentlemen, if we don't focus on this, we cannot call it reparations. We cannot call it reparations. We call it something else. Developmental aid, as I said, economic benefits and grants. And for these reasons and more, we the proposition firmly believe that reparations are primarily about restoring social dignity and self-worth over delivering economic benefits. Thank you.
And thank you very much. That was the first speaker from Presentation College, Chaguanas, Nile Bagan. Now, at this point in time, we invite the first speaker from Rawlins Academy, Aisha Basari, to take the stage.
Good morning, judges, timekeepers, and members of our opposition. First, I'd like to start by rebutting some of the points made by the proposition. First, public funds could be used to help better public health centers and increase access to mental health support, which would help to heal the psychological damage caused from enslavement. Also, more money into education could help people who struggle with their identity and sense of self. Also, targeting inner self is vague and hard to enforce and could vary from person to person. Now, I'd like to define our key terms. We define social dignity as acknowledging the inherent worth and deservingness of respect in every individual, and economic benefit as actions that produce measurable monetary advantages, including both direct economic payments and measures that will result in profit, such as debt cancellation or rebuilding infrastructure. Our first reason why we oppose the motion is because enslavement was primarily economic. Although there is no way to downplay the psychological or physical abuse the enslaved endured, Enslavement was, above all else, a system made to exploit Africans for economic benefit. Many formerly enslaved nations struggle to this day economically due to the aftermath of enslavement. This is because after emancipation, they were left with nothing and made to build their own countries independently without any, and they did not face any sort of compensation for the free labor. Point of information accepted.
So you're claiming that enslavement was primarily financial, however, except enslavement was a time, we do not agree, enslavement was a time where where the humans were stripped of their rights, and there's still a psychological and emotional impact of enslavement lasting till this day. Are you still saying that enslavement is primarily financial in that light?
Yes, because although enslavement did have horrible psychological impacts on the enslaved, it was primarily a system made to benefit the former colonizers, economically. And that is why I feel it is primarily an economic system. In fact, many nations were held back by having to compensate the former slave owners. For example, in 1833, former slave owners in the UK received a compensation of £20 million, which would be worth billions now. This was then placed on the Caribbean as a debt. This meant descendants of the enslaved had to pay back their oppressors for the loss of profit from enslavement. This has predictably damaged the economy hugely. Poverty rates average 30% of the Caribbean population. Haiti consistently scores lowest. Haiti also had to pay a large sum of money to France. While the economy continues to show moderate growth, the Caribbean continues to struggle with poverty and extensive public debt. There is still a significant wealth gap between people of color, particularly Black households and white households. In 2022, on average, for every $100 in wealth held by white households, Black households held only 15. If we can see that the harm was so overwhelmingly economic, the repair must also be economic. This would improve the quality of life and disassemble the exploitative after effects of enslavement that continue to burden millions. At its root, enslavement. Point of information accepted.
So you're saying that the harm was primarily economic, but wouldn't you agree that it's still a psychological and sociological and structural inequality that persists from enslavement that are mainly emotional and psychological harms that still persist to this day?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the point of information?
So you are claiming that the harm from enslavement was primary financial. However, wouldn't you agree that there's still that psychological, sociological, and emotional impact in form of structural inequalities and racism that still exists today?
We do agree that enslavement has left lasting psychological impact, but what we are arguing is not that this doesn't exist, but that it was primarily economic, as people still struggle, mainly economically, to this day.
And so we must restore economic.
So we must restore, so reparations must be mainly economic.
Dignity.
Now I'd like to introduce my second point, which is that dignity cannot be restored while economic inequality remains. Although it is incredibly important for the former colonizers to make an effort to rectify the social inequalities that come from enslavement, you cannot tell communities they are valued while leaving them in the same structural disadvantage created by enslavement. Social dignity becomes trivial when basic human necessities aren't met. Issues with poverty, healthcare, and education cannot be fixed through apologies or words. The UN has repeatedly stated that economic inequality in post-colonial states is a direct legacy of enslavement. People need stable living situations alongside apologies, reliable healthcare and recognition, a good quality of life just as much as social justice. People cannot be socially dignified when they can't be guaranteed basic human necessities. Restoring infrastructure, such as public health facilities and education centres, should take priority, as this would put many Caribbeans in a better state. Debt cancellation would significantly improve general well-being, and saying that Caribbean nations spend up to 30% of the GDP servicing debt, much of it inherited by colonial structures. The Caribbean is also facing a severe education crisis, with recent data revealing critical gaps in learning outcomes. In the 2024 Caribbean Secondary Education Certificate exams, only 4.9% of students passed 5 or more subjects. The pass rate of mathematics is 36. Contributing towards fixing these issues would then let social dignity be restored, as their worth would be acknowledged through the effort to improve their lives. This would then let social dignity be restored in Progress comes from genuine attempts to resolve the struggles born from enslavement, not verbal affirmations. Social dignity simply can't be restored unless these issues are resolved. Although restoring social dignity in itself is incredibly important, overriding the oppressive economic structures left by colonialism should take priority. Attempts to restore dignity mean next to nothing if people remain trapped in the conditions colonialism created. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. That was the first speaker from Rawlins Academy, Aisha Busari. At this point in time, we're going to enter into that exciting segment I was hinting at earlier. We call it the cross-examination. In this period, we will see the teams ask each other questions and answer those questions. So team opposition will ask 3 questions to team proposition, and team proposition will answer those questions. It's important to note that each question can last no more than 10 seconds, and only one person on the team who's asking the question can do so at any given point in time. For the team answering the question, you will have 4 to 5 seconds to do so, and the entire team can chime in to ensure that the answer addresses the concerns of the question in a robust and complete way. After team opposition has posed their questions to team proposition, we will allow the same privilege to team proposition to pose their questions to team oppositions. So with that said, let's get this cross-examination period underway. We do so by inviting the first question from Rawlins Academy being posed to Presentation College, Chaguanas.
How do you propose you restore dignity and self-worth under your model?
Can you repeat, please?
How do you propose you will restore dignity and self-worth under your model?
Well, actually, thank you very much, because that leads into my second point, which I will speak on, which are dignity restoration frameworks, which allow social dignity and self-worth to be restored through acknowledgement of wrongdoing, apology, correction of historical narratives, and legal recognition of the wrongdoings and status. Thank you.
If a government apologizes publicly and gives minimal economic reparations, is that sufficient?
First of all, the CARICOM 10-point plan states that we must first have apology. How did you get minimal economic benefits? We are saying that first we need to restore social dignity and self-worth through apology and these mechanisms, and then we can deal with economic benefits.
How can economic benefits not repair psychological harm when the facilities that help support mental health require funding to operate effectively?
Let's just clarify one thing. The proposition isn't claiming that there is no economic component to reparations. We are just saying that reparations, which means to repair, primarily must focus on the initial act of enslavement, which was the psychological and emotional impact that is left. If we're building a psychological hospital, and the end goal is to achieve better mental health and to fight these societal structures and restore social dignity and self-worth as the primary thing of reparations, and then it's in the ballpark of the proposition side of the motion, which isn't that economic benefit isn't important or that there isn't an economic benefit component to reparations. We are just saying the primary thing is to address that scar, is to repair for the wound of enslavement that still exists in structural inequalities today.
All right, that was very spicy. We invite the proposition now, Presentation College, to pose their questions to Rawlins Academy.
Okay, so if reparations are primarily economic, as the opposition is claiming, how do reparations differ from developmental aid or simply a loan?
We would suggest that reparations differ from developmental aids and loans because reparations, firstly, will not need to ever be paid back, and nor will, for example, they fit under the IMF structure, which a nation has to adhere to certain rules and categories. That would not be the case. The case would simply be to help the nation develop, and maybe even some help would be provided from the state giving reparations, which would not likely be the case with a loan, for example, the IMF.
So, do you believe that economic resources can effectively be used in a society that still experiences structural discrimination?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Do you believe that economic resources can be effectively used in a society, such as the psychological investment that Sophie was talking about? Do you believe that those resources can still be effectively used in a society that still experiences structural discrimination?
I think that the economic resources would help dismantle this structural disadvantages, and that is why it is so important that reparations are primarily about economic benefits, because this helps this would contribute to solving the issue at its root.
You spoke before in your speech, isn't it a basic human necessity to treat people like they are real human beings and to restore their self-worth and social dignity?
It is a human necessity, but it's also a human necessity that people do not live in extreme poverty. So we must treat a human necessity as treating someone with the food, water, everything they need to treat them as a human, which needs money to be given.
And poverty. And also, we'd like to add that poverty and the experience of extreme poverty negates any dignity that may be achieved, as poverty is proven to be an extremely undignifying and distressing experience, especially for children.
Wow, 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 wow. What a period of cross-examination, ladies and gentlemen. You can see that the questions were charged. You can see that the answers had bite to them. What a wonderful period. Now, to extend the debate, we invite the second speaker from Presentation College, Cyril Laberry, for team proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. Restore dignity, restore self-worth, restore justice. And as I mentioned, my first point is the dignity restoration framework. Our claim is explicit. Reparations are primarily about restoring social dignity and self-worth. Economic measures are secondary. This is because the original crime of enslavement was not just the theft of labor, it was the systematic stripping of human value that echoes to today. It was, as the Prime Minister would have mentioned, it's a stripping of identity, status, self-worth, treating human beings as if they were property. Now, the opposition mentioned they mentioned that economic benefits are more important, that they are primary. But I ask you, what is the foundation? What is the foundation that we stand upon? Our status, our social dignity, our self-worth. And without it, can we really take advantage of these economic benefits? We must invest in ourselves. And to restore the dignity and self-worth, we'll apply a dignity restoration framework, which operates through 4 mechanisms: official acknowledgement of wrongdoing, public apology, correction of historical narratives, and legal recognition of equal status. Ramaimanian, Beyond Retribution, identifies these not as only symbolic gestures, but as institutional requirements for legitimate repair. We need it. Dignity is socially produced. When a state defines people as inferior, that judgment does not disappear with time. It embeds itself into law, education, and self-perception. So is the opposition saying that we have to simply move on and accept these negative effects? Point of information, I accept.
Raising your point about dignity and the fact that the lack of dignity was the most important part of slavery, we would suggest that economic reparations can solve this, because under modern capitalism and government corruption, which is caused by a lack of economic resources, the descendants of the enslaved, whom many of them live in poverty, are still treated inhumanely and are still treated as subhuman.
Can you repeat?
We would like to argue your point that enslavement and reparations are mainly for restoring dignity, we'd like to suggest that economic reparations would help this, because under modern capitalism and corruption, many of the descendants of enslavement are still treated without dignity due to their low social class, and economic reparations would help that.
Thank you. No, economic benefits will not actually lead to restoring our social worth and social dignity and self-worth, because it will never target the wounds that were left, the trauma, the racism, the hate crimes, as my first speaker stated. Marcus Garvey framed reparations first as a psychological and social reclamation project. His call for racial pride, historical truth, and self-definition was not separate from justice, it was justice. Malcolm X rejected integration without recognition, arguing that economic access without restored dignity merely changes the setting of oppression. In his words, you cannot sit at the table if the host still believes you are lesser. Ladies and gentlemen, the opposition proposes that we give economic benefits while still living in the society without social dignity and self-worth for those who are wrong. But I give you an example of the African apprenticeship system where this exact thing was done and it did not work. History shows the danger of this. The African apprenticeship system provided wages, economic repair existed, yet dignity was withheld. As Thomas Cole documents in The Problem of Freedom, colonial authority, corporal punishment, and legal inequality remained intact. It was like paying damages to someone in a car accident, but they broke their bones. There will always be a wound, a scar, and a constant reminder of the incident. No amount of economic benefits can restore it, repair the pain, and make up for the trauma, because the body remembers. However, income was restored, identity was not. In contrast, the Germany reparations, the Holocaust, where there was actual acknowledgement and recognition of the issues paired with economic benefits. And that is what we ask. We ask for recognition. We ask for restoration of social worth, social dignity, and self-worth. Point of view, I accept.
We would like to suggest that with the German reparations for the Holocaust, it was not only an apology that was given. Some support was given monetarily, and some support was given to allow Jews to move in to new homes in the Middle East, which prevented them from becoming extremely disadvantaged in Europe.
Well, I stated that, first of all, it was first of all an apology. Documents by Christian Prost in Paying for the Past, survivors consistently reported that acknowledgement restored more than money alone. They acknowledged that the apology, that the rehabilitation and the recognition of the crimes done was more important than the money alone. And the opposition mentioned countries like Haiti, that they were, and I say yes, Haiti was stripped, they're in debt. Well, point of information, I decline. They were stripped of all that they were. They were stripped of their leader. They were stripped of their self-worth, their status, their dignity. And because of that, that is why they're in this position with the economic debt. Because of this. Because they have no basis to stand on. They don't have their status, their self-worth. I move on to my second point. Reparations must primarily restore dignity and self-worth because they can lead to social cohesion. Social cohesion is the degree of connectedness and solidarity among members of a society, expressed through shared trust, mutual support, and a sense of belonging. Where these are absent, societies do not merely remain unequal, they become unstable, and this is what I mean with Haiti. We had no social cohesion, there was no social dignity, no self-worth, and they were unstable. Thomas Piketty, in A Brief History of Equality, confirms that redistribution without historical accountability fails because harm is not only material, it is psychological and mental. You cannot rebuild a house on a cracked foundation by only repainting the walls. But where dignity is restored, cohesion follows. Because of the South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission prioritized acknowledgement and testimony over only compensation. Fulma Gobodo, in A Human Being Died That Night, documents just how being heard, survivors being heard and restoring their sense of citizenship and self-worth allowed for greater social cohesion, leading to full advantage of these economic benefits. The opposition states that these economic benefits will be able to fully take advantage of it. But I tell you no. I tell you, without the social dignity, without the self-worth, without knowing and getting rid of all of these institutionalized issues within the world, we'll be able to fully take advantage of the economic benefits. But first, primarily, we must deal with the social dignity and self-worth. Additionally, CARICOM Reparation Commission, Hilary Beckles, prioritizes apology, truth, and psychological rehabilitation alongside development, primarily restoring social dignity and self-worth. Restore dignity, restore self-worth, restore justice. Thank you.
And thank you very much. That was the second speaker from the team in proposition, Sail Labari. At this point in time, we invite Clara Byford from Rawlins Academy to extend the debate for side opposition.
Good day. To begin with, I would like to rebut some points made by our proposition. First of all, they make the point that money cannot heal dignity. Symbolism alone does not heal trauma either. Long-term dignity comes from security, mobility, power over one's life. These are created by assets, housing, education, and access to credit. These things that are economic. We would also like to say that they mention social inequality and social backlash and polarization. Backlash occurs against any reparations, including symbolic ones. Justice cannot be designed around the comfort of beneficiaries and injustice. Concrete programs with transparency, universalistic co-benefits mitigate backlash better than vague symbolism. Now I would like to begin to further expand, after my opposition leader, on our model. In our model, we argue that the mechanisms to reparations are primarily economic, with a reliable legal and concrete framework to deliver these economic benefits. Apologies and memorials are also a secondary mechanism, and dignity restoration is a byproduct to restoring justice. Now I would like to begin with our first argument, that prioritizing dignity lets former colonial powers avoid real responsibility. If reparations is framed as primarily about dignity, former colonizers can offer apologies instead of meaningful repair. Let's be real. Symbolic gestures are cheap. Economic reparations per actual accountability. We see examples of former colonial powers doing this in the Mau Mau abuses in Kenya. They offered an apology, a good apology, but minimal compensation. We see this again when the US apologized for the enslavement in 2008 with no financial reparations. Again, we cite Haiti, a crippled economy, a failed state that will never be healed with primarily apologies and primarily memorials. This motion lowers the bar so far that former colonial powers can step over it without paying a penny. Now, I would like to move on. Economic reparations create dignity. Dignity and economics are not opposites. Economic empowerment is one of the strongest ways to restore dignity. When communities gain access to education, healthcare, land, and investment, their dignity and self-worth naturally rise.
What is your mission?
Accepted.
Accepted. Yeah.
Accepted.
Okay. So if you're saying that these mechanisms that you have are the primary way to restore dignity, and the end goal is to restore dignity, wouldn't you agree that what reparations is about is indeed restoring social dignity and self-worth?
No, we are arguing that we argue in our motion that the primary thing that needs to be done is economic benefits, and that the primary goal is reversing inequality in infrastructure. And we restate that the motion is that it is primarily about restoring dignity as a mechanism of reparations. We argue the economic benefits are the mechanism to which we must repair reparations. Now, to continue. Studies on Indigenous communities in Canada show that economic compensation improved well-being, educational outcomes, and community pride. We also see Japanese Americans that were interned that received $20,000 each, and many that report that the payment validated their suffering. Economic justice is dignity in action. Now I would like to continue to our fifth point. Dignity is a vague, unenforceable, and subjective idea. To every community, it will mean something different, whereas economic reparations are concrete. You can not measure or enforce restoring dignity, but you can measure economic repair.
What are your mission?
Accepted.
So just because you can't measure or restore dignity, you can't measure how to restore dignity, we shouldn't even try to deliver that dignity or that justice to the people.
We agree it should be tried to be restored, but we also say that this gives former colonial powers the ability to say that what they have given, a small apology, or simply just a statement of regret is enough, because it is immeasurable. You will never be able to say when it is enough. They can also only give this and give lots of apologies, but it is no economic impact. And they state that because dignity is measurable, they have done so much. Now, if dignity is the primary focus, as its individually objective nature, so countries can, as I've said, claim they restore dignity with a speech or ceremony, when that is not the case. Economic reparations require actual commitments. An apology or speech can be found hollow, and an economic commitment means something must be done, otherwise there will be legal repercussions. The UK's expression of regret for slavery has been repeated for decades with no material change. Symbolic gestures in Australia and Canada did not reduce inequality until economic programs were introduced. CARICOM's 10-point CARICOM plan includes an apology, but it also includes many, many more points that are primarily reliant on economic benefits. This is why we believe we're in our final minute. And finally, I would like to say that economic benefits are the crucial mechanism, because they are the mechanism to achieve justice, and dignity and self-worth is a byproduct of justice. Thank you. Will you not have another minute?
All right, thank you very much. That was the second speaker from Rawlins Academy, Clara Byford. At this point in time, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to hop back into another period of cross-examination. This time, however, we'll invite the team in proposition to start out. And so, Presentation College, you may field your first question to Rawlins Academy.
So if the framework of reparations and the CARICOM 10-point plan, as you would have stated, is primarily economic, why does the CARICOM 10-point plan have apology as the first and foremost and most important goal, but also has things like repatriation, cultural institutions, African knowledge program, and psychological rehabilitation that all seek to restore the social dignity and self-worth of the formerly enslaved people?
The reason why we feel that reparations are primarily about economic benefits, even though it says this in the CARICOM plan, is because most of these points do rely on economic benefits. Psychological rehabilitation is reliant on having sufficient facilities to support people, and education programs rely on the funds to open these programs and to actually be able to educate people about enslavement.
Okay, you speak of Haiti, but would you not say that they were stripped of their self-worth, their social dignity, and their status, and that is why they're in economic debt and in this position? So the only way to restore it is by restoring social dignity and self-worth.
Well, with Haiti, I do believe that it's more complicated than they were simply stripped of their self-worth. While that is true, primarily they have been economically destroyed, having to pay billions to France, which can be seen in the complete anarchy that has taken over the system. For example, there is government corruption, greed, and violence, most of which is related to unmet economic needs, not to a lack of national cohesion.
If a country gave money but refused to apologize, is that justice?
We do believe that that's closer to justice, because it would allow the nation that they enslaved and abused to develop itself and to develop on its own terms. While we do believe that an apology is a secondary part of reparations, we fundamentally believe that economic is needed before any apology, because without economic reparations, any apology, statement, or monument runs hollow.
Also, if they were to deny an apology, it is also part of the 10-point CARICOM plan. And we do agree that an apology is necessary, but it must be secondary, because we must first restore people's necessary rights, and an apology will be given afterwards, because along with the money that is given, the Caribbean will become more globally recognized than it is and will become more of global power. Therefore, they will be more recognized, and therefore the former colonial powers will feel more obliged and the former Caribbean will have more power to want an apology.
Indeed, thank you very much. We flip the arrangement and invite Rawlins Academy to pose their questions to Presentation College.
Who decides what enough dignity restored and the method of dignity is enough for an entire community?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Who decides how many apologies, statements of regret, and memorials, or any other method, are enough to restore dignity?
Well, because of the deep trauma, the wounds, and the impacts of slavery, of enslavement, it is never enough, because we need to fully restore and the self-worth and social dignity of the person. Economic benefits would also not be enough. We need primarily social dignity and self-worth.
And also just to clarify that social dignity and self-restoring is not just an apology. Formerly the descendants of enslaved people today still face racism, structural inequality. They still, as my first speaker would have stated, have where black sounding names get rejected jobs. There is still a structural inequality that exists. It's not just an apology, and if an apology was given, it was not enough because it has not corrected this historical narrative, and it has not restored their social dignity and self-worth, which is what reparations, which means to repair, is primarily about.
Are you comfortable with a world where dignity is restored, but extreme undignified poverty remains?
Of course not. But the primary thing that must be fixed, we're not saying there is nothing economic about reparations, We are just saying the primary thing that will also help the descendants of the enslaved people to claim reparations is to restore their position in society. We don't want blood money given in a society that still has structural inequality and racism and hate crimes that still continue to even affect their economic standing till this day.
How are we supposed to take advantage of these economic benefits, these economic repay, if they do not stand with their social dignity and self-worth within the society and they're able to take advantage of it, if they're still being discriminated against?
How would your model, firstly, decrease discrimination in the Caribbean and decrease discrimination against the Caribbean worldwide?
Well, the dignity restoration frameworks aim to acknowledge the wrongdoings. As far as I know, that has not occurred. They will apologize and correct the historical narratives in which all of these issues were done. Then it would further restore social dignity and self-worth within these persons through programs and psychological rehabilitation, so that that way they can then take advantage of the economic benefits that we require.
Ooh, indeed, and that concludes the second period of cross-examination. At this point in time, the debate is going to pause for a minute so that we can all catch our breath and so that the finishing touches can be placed on that reply speech. This speech will be each team's final shot to prove why they have won this debate. We give you this 1 minute so that you can finalize that speech. This 1 minute break starts now. All right. That is 1 minute. Teams, Here is your final shot. To conclude the debate for Team Rawlins Academy, we invite their third and final speaker, Edith Marshall.
Okay, to start our final speech, firstly, I hope you're all having a wonderful day, but we would like to rebut some of the arguments and claims that have been made by our opposition. So they suggested that money does not repair psychological harm. We do not believe this to be true. Not only will economic benefits provide a stronger health system and stronger educational system, both of which are associated with better psychological outcomes, it will also prevent further psychological harm going forward. Being raised in extreme poverty is a risk factor for severe mental illness such as bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And if economic reparations were introduced, this rates of extreme poverty would decline, and therefore rates of extreme mental illness and more mild mental illness such as depression and anxiety would reduce. We would also like to rebut the constant suggestion that our opposition have made that we do not care about dignities or apologies. We do believe that dignity and apology is important. However, we do not believe this is the primary method of reparation. We believe that reparation should be economic and provide a strong social base. For example, our opposition mentioned that they believe that economic reparations will not fix social bases. We simply do not believe that this is true. The class system is deeply unequal and socially damaging in the Caribbean, with some of the wealthiest people owning 10 times more than some of the poorest. Therefore, we believe that economic retribution and reparations, which would allow social mobility, would increase dignity and also social cohesion, as people will become more educated and more able to progress their own social class. We also believe that economic reparations are positive for the wider position of the Caribbean in the world. For example, economic reparations would allow the Caribbean to grow its economy, especially in the skills-based and educational sectors, and this would increase its standing on the global stage and allow for increased trade and equality with Western nations. For example, we suggest Rwanda, which after the genocide in 1994 redeveloped itself with the help of the UN and became a stronger state with a better reputation on the world stage, and is now considered one of the successful nations in Africa. However, we also believe that the opposition team have been currently ignoring our questions. We do not believe that they have answered our questions with enough dignity, nor do we believe that they have answered our questions properly. We believe that they have just repeated themselves and they have not provided evidence or substantial claims to answer our questions. And we also believe that the poor descendants of the enslaved are treated with inhumanity due to their extreme poverty. Extreme poverty not only reduces one's psychological health and comfort. For example, children who live in extreme poverty show higher rates of anxiety and depression in childhood, which is negative for both cardiovascular and mental health. Also, the class system creates dehumanization, as those at the top, who are primarily white, view those at the bottom with disdain or with indifference, much like the slave owners viewed the slaves. And I'm by no means saying that poverty is as bad as slavery, but it still should not be the case in the Caribbean that the descendants of the enslaved suffer from such extreme poverty. You also argued that there is a cracked social foundation. Now, we believe that economic reparations would help this because they would help provide infrastructure. For example, we can have a look at the influence of China in Africa, which has helped provide multiple pieces of infrastructure, particularly in Zimbabwe, such as road networks and rail networks. And this has created economic growth, and it has also created greater social cohesion as people have the power not only to get to work, but also to move around and spread ideas about culture and society with them. Finally, we would like to reinstate our motion that we believe reparations should be primarily economic, and that restoring dignity and justice should be a secondary and would come as a result of economic reparation.
Thank you very much. That was the final speaker from the Rawlins Academy, Edith Marshall. Now, to conclude this debate overall, we invite Vishnava Ramjas from Team Presentation College.
Ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. My name is Vaishava, and I'm here today to prove to you why reparations are primarily about restoring social dignity and self-worth rather than delivering economic benefits. Now, to start, the opposition would have raised this argument that enslavement was primarily an economic system. Now, maybe from the POV of the colonial powers, enslavement was primarily an economic system. But from the POV of the enslaved people, where they had their cultures torn apart, their human rights stripped, and they were treated as property, there is still that wound. Enslavement is not primarily an economic system. It is an emotional one. It is a wound that is left till this day. And if we really want to begin to heal that wound, as my first speaker stated, the psychological, sociological, and emotional impacts of enslavement need to be corrected to enable repair to occur. That repair, that true repair, is what reparations seeks to achieve, what reparation is about. Secondly, the opposition would have raised this argument about the development of the Caribbean, about the healthcare and the education, and even would have spoken about developing the Caribbean so we can have psychological institutions to rehabilitate the descendants of the enslaved people. Now, let me clarify one thing that we have said that the proposition has been explicitly clear. The proposition is not claiming there is no economic component to reparations. We are just saying that what reparations is about is restoring social dignity and self-worth. And that is what it's primarily about. Ladies and gentlemen, they were talking about the psychological rehabilitation end up in fighting the poverty and fighting the mindsets and fighting the inequalities. So if the end goal is to restore social dignity and self-worth in all of the plans that the opposition are saying, are they not agreeing with us? Remember, we are here to argue what reparations is primarily about. We are here to argue what the main cause, the main dish of reparations is about. Not the plated served up upon, not the mechanism by which we achieve reparations. We are here to argue what reparations is about. This leads me to my next question. We seem to have gotten into this argument of the chicken or the egg, because if it's economic benefit first, or if it is restoring social dignity and self-worth first. Well, let me clarify something. As my second speaker would have stated, the very first thing on the CARICOM 10-point plan is that apology. And his dignity restoration framework, as he stated, highlights how and why dignity restoration is imperative. That apology being first on the CARICOM 10-point plan is not a mistake. It is an intentional thing because it is the most important thing to ensure the injustice of enslavement are stopped and are cut in the bud at where they are at. Additionally, how does the opposition expect us to take advantage of the economic benefits when there is still a structural inequality? You can have all the money in the world, but as my speaker would have stated, where it is a structural system where black names and black people are still discriminated against. What good will economic benefits do in a structural system that still reinforces that? This leads me to my next point. Why do we even have this poverty? Why do we even have all of these problems? It is because enslavement reinforced this narrative that the black people, like formerly, that the descendants of the enslaved people are lower in class, are lower in system. They would even agreed about the class system that can exist within society. Once again, let me ask, how can you achieve something? How can you even herald something economic if you do not first recognize it was wrong? If you do not first recognize and understand and try to fix the injustice itself, which was the stripping of human rights. This leads me to my last point. We need the social cohesion as what is needed in today's society to fight the remaining injustices from enslavement. We don't want blood money given in a society where there is still societal inequality, hate crimes, and racism. Once again, how are the descendants of the enslaved people to claim the advantage of economic benefits as the opposition was stated, if they still exist in a society that portrays them as less and lower than? This is what the proposition is seeking. The proposition is not saying that there is no economic component to reparations. We're not saying that reparations is not economic. We are just saying that the defining quality of reparations, the thing that defines reparations is repair. And repair can only exist by dismantling the structural inequality, by dismantling the system that still exists from enslavement, by repairing through restoring the social dignity and self-worth of the people. And if you do not restore the social dignity and self-worth of the people, it isn't reparations, because it is not repairing the actual harm. It is not fixing the actual problem. it is simply a financial aid or a loan. All the development that the proposition was spoken about, those things could be achieved by loan or development. But they can't achieve what reparation seeks to achieve, which is to repair through restoring the social dignity and self-worth of the people. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. That was Vishnava Ramjas from Presentation College. And thank you very much to all 6 of our debaters for starting the morning off in a spectacular way. The judges are now going to excuse themselves to a different space for a few moments to discuss and decide who will be winning this match, and of course to provide you with some good feedback. So stay tuned, the judges will return momentarily.
Take a seat, students. History class is in session. Let's explore the words rooted in the runes of the Caribbean.
Let's check R. Right doesn't get in the dictionary, but rape and robbery ran without containment. Yeah, I'm talking about enslavement.
A reprehensible reign of terror, for which Caribbean people are still missing recovery, as reparations aren't in the dictionary. Forget the N-words once used, because the only N-word we want to see is
No, we need reparations. No.
We are the Rawlins debate team and we want to be a part of the reparation debate competition.
I've always loved debating, but this debate has ignited a passion in me like no other. Being a part of the research team last year was such a wonderful experience I hope to relive.
This matters because this issue is a wrong that must be made right. This competition gives us an opportunity to immerse ourselves in this cultural experience.
The Center for Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this international reparation debate competition. This international reparation debate competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged and their voices are heard.
Why is reparation so important in and for the Caribbean? Because time comes for justice for our ancestors. Time comes for the Caribbean to insist on the right to development, to be compensated for the violence against our ancestors. So outreach to the young people who have joined this movement is critical.
There is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. And we certainly want reparations to be a mass movement. So it's really exciting, though, to have a regional / international debating competition. And I'm looking forward to your participation as you construct your arguments for and against, remembering that the 10-point plan for reparatory justice is our guiding framework for the areas in which we are demanding compensation, because we certainly want to impact the public opinion and awareness in Europe. So it's fantastic to have the United Kingdom participating as well.
So why is it important for youth to be involved in the reparation movement? Being involved in the reparations movement is critical to youth if one is to know their history so that they can understand why their societies are functioning as they are today. The future of the countries we live in are dependent on the current situation that exists today in our countries. And these current conditions were created by the past, including indigenous genocide, African enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. Being involved in reparations is about seeking justice, seeking a way to reduce inequalities in our own countries and then in the broader world. It's about seeking a more peaceful and balanced world, where global problems are solved in partnerships, not in isolation. I believe the sponsors are hoping this competition will allow our youth to gain knowledge about the past so that as young people, you'll be able to make better decisions in the future and make our countries better places.
We know that we need to understand stories about people that look like us. So the fact that so many of you young people have registered was so encouraged by your enthusiasm and your passion for wanting to enter this debate. It is so important. It's just at the core of who we are, that we need to understand where we come from, understand our true history, and having a debate competition on this particular topic is such an important milestone. To have a real conversation about repair, and the fact that our young people were so articulate with their presentations, and to ensure that we keep educating our young people, because you are the future of us and are the Caribbean's a sustainable future. So congratulations, everybody.
We are looking forward to the debate. Encourage everyone to join the debate. Thank you so much, all.
Education about the history of the oppression of a people can either be a tool for liberation or a tool for reinforcing trauma. What allows for education to be one or the other is not the topics taught, but how they are delivered. Therefore, we, the proposition, would like to firmly state that teaching the history of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, or TTEA for short, does significantly more harm than good, not because of the topic, but because of the current pedagogical approach taken. Your average high schooler learns about the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans through a rigid, standardized curriculum. They are taught by a teacher who is expected to simply deliver information, often in a lecture format, and test students on their ability to memorize facts, years, and names. In this setting, students are not invited to engage critically with the material, ask difficult questions, or relate the content to their own lived experiences. Instead, they passively receive a version of history unable to truly process its relevance, impact, or emotional weight. Where is the opportunity to understand how this horror shaped the blood in our veins and the names we carry? There is none. Students memorize facts and regurgitate them on paper. But inside, the lesson lingers, that the history of the African diaspora is one of subjugation, and that their place in the world is to suffer and survive, not to lead, not to thrive. This is exactly what Paulo Freire, in his work The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, described as the banking method of education, where students are treated as empty accounts to be filled by the teacher. Freire believed this model was fundamentally oppressive because it prevents learners from becoming active participants in their own liberation. It discourages dialogue, reflection, and consciousness raising. This is what he calls conscientization. The teaching of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans today in many classrooms still follows this harmful pattern. When this topic is taught in a banking method that assumes dichotomy between human beings and the world they live in, Freire says an individual is a spectator rather than a recreator. This kind of teaching doesn't empower, it conditions students to fit into a world shaped by oppression rather than resist it. And that is why we say it does more harm than good, because it teaches history in a way that keeps students passive, not engaged. We learn about Oladoye Ekiano, we learn his name, we learn that he experienced this and he wrote an account, but do we open the book and study it and analyze it and discuss it with our teachers the way that Israeli schools discuss Elie Wiesel's Night of the Holocaust? The opposition says they want students to learn about the slave trade and the enslavement of a people. And of course, we all want all students across the world to have reverence for this grave and absolutely horrific period of history. And we do this with the intention that learning about it can empower them to challenge the lingering legacies of racism and inequality. However, defending the status quo, which our opposition seeks to uphold and claims offers us more good than harm, will not offer us this. This is not remembrance. This is not reverence. And when you trace the system back to its roots, you realize that this is not our system at all. Accepted.
The fact that students today are not just learning about the brutality, but also about the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies, creating empowerment more than harm.
Right. Our issue is not with these topics being taught, but it is the way that they are taught and the way that they are emphasized with regards to all of the other things that are occurring within African history. To continue, our education system was inherited from Britain, a colonial power that had no interest in nurturing Caribbean identity or liberation. And what good can we expect from teaching this topic when we are continuing to do so in England's pedagogical approach? Even worse, as you mentioned, African history is taught in the Americas and Europe as though it began with slavery. From primary school, students are introduced to African people not through the glory of their kingdoms, their intellectual traditions, or their achievements, but through their chains. Why is it so hard for you to name a single black figure whose legacy is not defined by resistance or white oppression? Why is it that we teach about Toussaint and Nani but not Imhotep, Mansa Musa, or Queen Nzinga in the same breath? This should be taught first. And compare this to how the Holocaust is taught in Israeli. This is taken from the Israeli Ministry of Education.
Point of information.
Declined. Children are introduced to the brilliance of their culture first, their thinkers, their faith, and their resilience before they are taught about genocide. Their oppression is contextualized within a legacy of strength, not as the first chapter. If that isn't a pedagogical problem, then what is? When slavery is taught primarily as a story of powerlessness and victimization, with the current banking method of pedagogy, it does more than inform. It deeply affects the psychological development of students, particularly those of the African diaspora. During adolescence, a critical time for identity formation, as described in Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, students are particularly vulnerable to internalizing messages about their race and their place in history. If the dominant narratives they encounter emphasize subjugation or this constant need to fight without also highlighting pre-colonial civilizations and agency, students may inherit a sense of trauma and inferiority. Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson's 1995 concept of stereotype threat shows that students underperform when they fear confirming negative stereotypes about their group, a common experience for Black students navigating a curriculum saturated with ancestral suffering. In classrooms where Black students only encounter these narratives and are rarely offered examples of greatness before colonial times, they are more likely to fear confirming negative stereotypes about Black intellectual inferiority. And yes, this study found that this did significantly reduce their academic performance. In contrast, we argue for emancipatory pedagogy, which views students as active co-creators of knowledge and encourages reflection, dialogue, and transformation. We want students to read and discuss the first accounts, and this should be a mandatory part of the curriculum, not an option. Additionally, students should be first met with pre-colonial history that showcases the richness and strength of Africans from various tribes and kingdoms before delving into the horrors of the slave trade. Through student-centered dialogic approaches, this topic becomes not a detached narrative of victimhood, but a pathway to critical consciousness where students develop an internal locus of control, a sense of pride, and the tools to challenge injustice. When classrooms prioritize empathy, voice, and critical inquiry over memorization, the teaching of the TTEA can become what Freire calls a practice of freedom, not oppression. We are fully justified in arguing that teaching the history of the TTEA causes more harm than good on the basis of the heavily flawed pedagogy. In parliamentary debate, motions like this are evaluated based on the status quo, meaning how things are actually occurring now. As such, the opposition cannot shift the debate by suggesting that in some ideal future it could be taught differently or argue on the basis of the principle. We are debating the present, and the burden is to defend the way that it is taught now. Thank you.
All protocols observed, the opposition remains resolute against the motion. This House believes that the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans causes more harm than good. We in the opposition agree that there are flaws in the method, but we argue that even in its current form, teaching this history does far more good than harm. We accept the definitions posited by the opposition with the exception of the word harm. Harm caused by the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans in this case is more like temporary discomfort that fosters long-term justice awareness and healing. The proposition burden is to prove that the act of teaching this history is inherently harmful, even when taught well, and that these harms are so deep and widespread that they outweigh all educational and social benefits. We must prove that the current approach generates more harm than good, and 2, the harm is not inherent to the method but as a result of poor implementation, and 3, that the teaching of enslaved Africans creates civic awareness, empathy, prevention of recurrence, and general social progress. The status quo, the history of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans is already being taught, but with growing care and impact. Students today are learning not just about the brutality, but also the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies of inequality. Yes, some schools get it wrong. Reform is being done for more inclusive, trauma-informed, and empowering education, making it the norm. Mr. Speaker, we are not for the current way of teaching this history. The motion didn't state the current way. We are for the best way of teaching this history. Allow me to rebut. And this best way is trauma-informed teaching. This would be training teachers to handle emotional topics with care, no graphic reenactment, use check-ins, and create safe spaces. This builds resilience instead of re-traumatizing students. And 2, balancing the story. Don't stop at brutality. Teach about African civilization, resistance leaders like Nani of the Maroons, and achievements of the African diaspora that restores pride and identity. 3, we would center real voices, use person accounts, African scholars, and cultural sources to humanize the content and shift away from cold textbook trauma, and link the past to the present, which will let students reflect through debate, which is already being done, and modern connections to racism and justice. This transforms discomfort into action and purpose, including Black educators. Involve Black voices in teaching is as authenticity, prevents tone deafness, and build trust in diverse classroom. This is credible as the RAN program has a similar approach, and it has proven to be working, as it has a 94% increase in the racial unity and empowerment. Allow me to rebut the misconceptions provided by the government. The government stated that teaching of trafficking of enslaved African causes discomfort and psychological harm. But let me say that discomfort is not harm, Mr. Speaker. And the 2019 UNESCO states that students taught slavery alongside resistance have greater empathy and understanding of justice. And secondly, discomfort is necessary for growth and historical reckoning, just like the Holocaust education or genocide studies. They also stated that the current method does not include the history before slavery. But Mr. Speaker, let me say that this is a big misconception. Most syllabi incorporates the history of the Africans before they were colonized. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Mansa Musa. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Songhai Empire. It is in the rationale also
Points of information
that the teachers should use discussions to actually engage the students. In today's debate, I will bring 2 substantive. 1, the current methods build civic awareness, empathy, and critical thinking. And 2, discomfort from learning is not the same as harm. It leads to empowerment. My second speaker will discuss justice and the prevention of repetition in the injustice, while my third speaker will prove why we remain supreme. Our first substantive is the harm lies in the method, not the content. My first warrant is balanced teaching that includes stories of resistance and survival, reduces emotional harm, and builds empathy. When we emphasize both suffering and human dignity in the trafficking of enslaved Africans by teaching resistance, African agency, and survival, we shift from trauma to empowerment. It does more harm than good because it builds pride, resilience, and understanding. For example, the Holocaust education isn't taught by showing only images of death camps. They come with stories of resistance, survival, and moral courage. It fosters pride, empathy, and moral courage instead of guilt or division. That's why balanced, trauma-informed teaching benefits are supreme. My second warrant is effective, safe teaching already exists and work. We're seeing programs like Facing History and Ourselves offer concrete evidence that teaching hard history can be both emotionally and safe, intellectually enriching. According to a 2021 RAN Corporation study, students in these programs which is a reform program by the way, show that 94% increase in civic agency, meaning they felt more empowered to take social action and reported deeper empathy, stronger historical understanding, and more open-minded attitude. And the fact that we're seeing this in real classroom, Mr. Speaker, proves that harm is not inherent to the topic. It's about how we design the curriculum and support teachers, and we are currently doing this now through reform. If we have models that work, and we do, then the moral burden shifts to improving delivery, not erasing the content. What my third warrant is suppressing this history causes more harm than good. Mr. Speaker, be aware that we're not talking just about the current history. We're talking about the teaching of the history overall, because that's what the mood says. In environments where slavery is ignored or downplayed, misinformation spreads like wildfire. Students grow up believing that slavery was minor, that racism is just a mere relic of the past, or that systemic inequality is simply an overreaction. This ignorance sustains real-world harm, and contrary to this, we're seeing that countries like Germany, who have faced their history head-on with regards to the Holocaust, show lower levels of historical denialism and far-right extremism than those that whitewash. whitewash. The impact, it promotes social equity and activism, because when students learn this history accurately and empathetically, they become more socially aware, engaged, and ready to challenge injustice. And 2, it empowers empathetic, informed citizens who are empowered to fight modern injustice. And 3, it protects future generations from repeating injustice itself. My second substantive is silence enables racism to thrive. My first warrant is when schools avoid teaching slavery, they leave students with distorted or incomplete narratives. In the absence of formal education, when students are left to piece together understanding from biased media, peer opinions, or online misinformation, the result is a deeply distorted view of race and history. A 2018 SPLC report showed that only 8% of the US high school seniors could identify slavery as the primary cause of the Civil War. When students believe that slavery was a voluntary arrangement or that racism ended in 1865, it undermines every effort to promote justice and equality today. Silence gives racism plausible deniability that it suggests falsely that if we don't talk about injustice, it must not exist. The impact, it ensures future generations. And with that, the proposition momentarily rests.
400 years ago. 400 years ago, my people were dragged from their homes, tribes, families, placed on floating wood, and shipped across the Atlantic to what will be later described as the most inhumane act of all time. Cold, dark, uncomfortable, cannot describe the trip in ships where whips did not fail to miss. Injustice, rape and disgrace, blood rains, brute, force, ignorance, hate in their veins. Sweat and tears, labor revealed, produce from king fields only for the esteemed. 400 years of eroding one's pride, culture, heritage, value. 400 years of the iron chain, stringing up, leaving bare. Oh, but they never cared. Why fight when you would be met with sharp blades? So don't you dare cry out in fear. Why not plan escape with the plaiting of one's hair? Oh, the drums, listen, dance, communicate. For tonight we fight a battle not even death could spare. Blue eyes, white skin, master said there's beauty within. But guess what? Black, brown, gold, royalty, reparations we are owed. Them say hassa, but we say cassava. That's where we get the strength from to beat and conquer. For tonight we're returning to Ghana. You may say, I'm a descendant of slaves because of the rich melanin that gushes from my pores. But I came to tell you tonight, I am not a slave. Rather the descendant of kings and queens. I am the embodiment of the divine. I do not chase, I align, I attract. What's meant for me already has my name on it. I am the personification of beauty, the expression of love, the creator of life, the acknowledgement of freedom. So go ahead, call me what you want, because when I die, bury me in the oceans where my ancestors jumped from the ships, because they knew death was better than bondage.
This is something that I wanted to discuss since Emancipation Day, but did you know that Britain only finished paying for slavery in 2015? Yes, 2015 as in 10 years ago. This fact was revealed in a since deleted tweet back on February 9, 2018 by the then Her Majesty's Treasury. In 1833, Britain borrowed 40% of its national budget, £20 million, to finance the Slavery Abolition Act. This act was the official end of British slavery and went into effect on August 1, 1834. The money that was borrowed was used to repay British slave masters for their quote-unquote loss of property. However, for the enslaved, there was no repayment and no form of compensation was offered. The amount that was borrowed, the £20 million, was equal to £2.2 billion in today's money. The since deleted tweet from Her Majesty's Treasury pointed out that the taxes paid by people today was used to repay the loan that paid the slave masters. This would mean that people from the Windrush generation and their descendants, people from Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago and other British colonies, would have helped to repay the loan taken out to pay the people who enslaved their ancestors. Using this video, I want to highlight that when people say that slavery was so long ago, 400 years ago, ancient history and we should get over it, we can see that it wasn't that long ago. If we look at a timeline of the history of Barbados, we can see that chattel slavery in Barbados lasted 207 years, whereas the time from emancipation in 1834 to today is only 191 years. So as a nation, we spent longer in slavery than we've spent free. I want you to think about that. Facts like these are why people have started a call for reparations, to correct an injustice done to us as a nation, a region, and a people. If you want to learn more about reparations and how you can be involved, click the link in my bio.
Ladies and gentlemen, the judges are back and we have in our possession the results of this match. First of all, I want to say this was a good debate and both teams should be very, very happy with themselves. This sets the tone for the day. This is evidenced by the fact that the scores ending the round, 281 points to the winning team, to the team that did not advance, 279. A 2-point difference in a really high scoring match. All right. So how did the debate shape out? This house believes that reparations are primarily about restoring social dignity and self-worth rather than delivering economic benefits. Now, here's a really important and key thing in this motion. This motion says this house believes it is a principled motion, not necessarily a policy motion. And there's a meaningful distinction between the two. Because of the principled nature of this motion, it's not necessary for one to provide a mechanism on how one will achieve the thing, but mainly a question of how or why that thing that we hold to be morally better is in fact morally better or not morally better. So the other thing that we want to talk about is a measure of primarily about restoring social dignity. So this is a really important key context in the debate. When we say something is primarily about this, even if something else achieves this goal better, it doesn't change the fact that it is primarily about that thing. Let me use actual examples from the debate to ground this analysis a little bit more for you. See, Rawlins Academy tells us that we get greater social dignity and self-worth when we have the money from reparations to do these things, right? When we have the money to do these things, we get better economic outcomes. Rather, we get better social outcomes. Presentation College points out something. If we get better outcomes for social dignity and self-worth through economic help, you are effectively saying social dignity and self-worth are primarily important, right? It's something that Vaishnava pointed out and the judges ultimately agreed. If we need economic benefits to accomplish these social dignities, you are not necessarily winning for yourself very much points because the motion is about which one is more important. What you're saying is that we need the money to do the thing, to do the social dignity, not necessarily that the money is more important. So the money becomes a means to an end, and the end is social dignity. And so that's something that we want to point out was a deficiency on your case, Rawlins Academy. The good news, though, Rawlins Academy, is that that was not the most substantive pieces of your case. These contentions came out largely through points of information, and these concerns came out a lot in the reply speech. But the substantive analysis were actually quite good. So what did we hear comparatively from the both teams, right? We hear from Team Rawlins Academy, particularly from the first and second speaker, it really landed home. It really hit home from Clara Byford. See, Clara tells us, right, in no uncertain terms, that what we really need is people to come out of poverty. She painted a really graphic and depressing picture of what life is like in the Caribbean as a result of the fact that we were extracted and well shipped abroad and none of our systems were being there. She told us that we're poor. She told us that 30% of us are suffering from poverty. And she told us that we lack the education and infrastructure and healthcare systems, and that is something that is undignifying and that is far more important than social dignity. We hear that in no uncertain terms from Clara. We thought that was very good. We hear, however, from Presentation College that we need these social structures to exist primarily to solve for these issues. And this is big and important. They told us that we have psychological traumas. And Niall told us brilliantly, we believe as well, the setup for the justification for this. He now tells us that psychological trauma is something that expands beyond generations. It's something that is ingrained within our bodies and it's something that we internalize. And so we have an internal assessment of why we need a social dignity. But then he also goes and gives an external assessment, a structural one. We get that a lot from Niall. We get it as well from Sahil. Sahil tells us as well that we need social cohesion. And that is an external thing. And we don't get that social cohesion by just having a bunch of money being deposited into the bank accounts of the government. We need that social cohesion because of social dignity. Social dignity actually is something that undermines our social cohesion, and that's something that we necessarily need. Now, when we weigh this up, right? Like I said, lovely debate. When we weigh it up, we had this clash now. We had to be weighing dignity versus the economics. The intrinsic self-worth dignity versus the economics that we got from Rawlins College. How did we see this debate shaping out on that clash? We think that there needed to have been just a little bit more work from Presentation College to explain to us why the dignity materializes into a particular outcome. Why is it? We fully understand how we are lacking in social dignity and the importance of it. What we wanted to understand, the solid important thing that we wanted to understand in the debate is how apologies are part of the value of reparations versus other forms of developmental aid. City Presentation College tells us that the value of reparation, the unique and intrinsic value of reparation, is based solely in the matter of social dignity, and that differs from other forms of aid economics, such as developmental aid. They tell us, at least attempt to tell us, that the difference between reparation that makes reparation primarily about social dignity is that we can get economic aid elsewhere from the different institutions, but reparation primarily has to be attached to an apology to make it distinct. We think that's an interesting idea. Wanted to hear a little bit more about it. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I won't keep you for far much longer because I know you want to hear the call. And so, on 281 points, a staggering score, the team that wins this match and will automatically advance to round 3 of this competition is the team in opposition, Rawlins Academy.
Congratulations. 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 Well debated.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much to our proposition. You guys were amazing. Thank you also to judges and everyone who hosted today. It was a wonderful debate.
Indeed, it was. Congratulations, Rawlins Academy. Presentation College, you end with 279 points. I know I said it before, but in many other matches, a score of 279 would have given you a definitive victory. So well played, Presentation College. Congratulations, Rawlins Academy. The best debater from this match comes to us from Rawlins Academy, and that was their second speaker, Clara Byford. Congratulations, Clara. we loved how you broke down in very statistical and gut-wrenching explanations the need for economic dignity. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes match number 4 in round 2 rather of the International Reparation Debate Competition for 2026. Join us at 11, where San Fernando Central Secondary School from Trinidad and Tobago will play off against CV Bessel Senior High from Bahamas. The motion: this House believes that government apologies for colonial harms are meaningless without public support for reparation. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful rest of your day. Guys.